President. This is quite a short bill, but it's also a very complicated bill as it attempts to balance competing rights, concerns and values. On the one side, we have gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender people with a deep concern about being discriminated against in their workplace, their school or other places for simply being who they are. But then we have faith-based schools and communities with deeply held spiritual and moral values that they want to live in line with and raise their children in. These are challenging questions of competing values and rights that are not easy to balance. Then there is the question of the role of government and if and where it is appropriate for the elected government of the day to declare some of these rights and values more important than others and impose this view on people through legislation. Before I speak on how we came to a position on this bill, I would like to thank the thousands of people that have contacted me to share their views. There were many emails both urging me to support and oppose this legislation. While the bill makes only some small changes, I think this is indicative of the fact that these small changes touch on areas at the core of people's identities. Who they are, what they believe and what gives their lives meaning. I would also like to thank Equality Australia, the Australian Christian Lobby, the Australian Association of Christian Schools Australia and representatives of the Muslim and Jewish faith communities who met with me and for sharing their views on this legislation. When we first considered this bill, we thought that we would likely support it. While we support the right for people to live and teach in line with their religious beliefs, discriminating in areas utilising taxpayer funds creates a more complicated question. If they were funded completely independently, then it would be a much easier question. However, parents that want to send their kids to a faith-based school are also taxpayers. The Liberal Democrats believe in a more decentralised education sector and believe in choice and the power of the market to meet the needs of people. It is in the area of education employment that this bill is most contentious, and this is the area that we receive the most correspondence about. The stakeholders that we met with were broadly in agreement that it should be very clear and transparent during the hiring process, that it was an expectation that staff should uphold the religious and moral values of the school. We agree. It would be unreasonable for someone to be hired where this expectation wasn't clearly explained and then have their employment terminated for not meeting the requirements that weren't clearly explained. Much of the concern in this bill surrounds the inherent requirements test. Is adherence to the faith of the school an inherent requirement of the role? The stakeholders from faith communities and representatives from faith-based schools that we met with held the view that this legislation fundamentally misunderstands the nature of these faith-based schools and the motivation of parents that want their children educated in line with their faith. The way that the inherent requirements test is structured suggests that only teachers that are specifically teaching religion would have an inherent requirement to be adherents of the faith. Why would it be necessary to be a Christian or a Muslim when your primary role is teaching trigonometry and calculus? This misunderstands the nature of the school community. There are camps, excursions and a whole range of activities that extend simply beyond teaching maths. It really is an education community rather than simply an education facility, and in the case of faith-based schools, it is a faith-based education community. And indeed, one of the Jewish community representatives that we spoke with said that the idea of employing people in their schools was around them being able to live and model the values of their culture and religion to act as an example for the students at that school, and that disrupting that would provide a contradiction to the students of that school. Is it so strange for an employer to have a stringent code of conduct? For my own staff, their code of conduct is 16 pages long, and when hiring them, I have the ability to discriminate based on political beliefs. Across the public service, there are a range of rules that cover their behaviour, including outside the workplace and commenting on social media. As long as faith-based schools clearly explain and consistently enforce the requirements of any role, they should not be interfered with by the state. Could there have been improvements on the status quo? Yes, but as with much of the legislation that this government brings to this place, they raise an important issue or an area that needs reform and take it too far. The last 2 years has shown us how this government, when presented options for balance or nuance, has a tendency to steamroll opposition and smash through their view of the world. Ms. Watt seemed to suggest that LGBTQI people were frequently being fired for simply living their lives, as if this was some kind of terrible discrimination that was happening every week. But the stakeholders that we met with on both sides suggested that it was actually quite rare that this situation came up. Stakeholders that we met with suggested that it was far more common that issues related to adultery caused problems with employees than people being sacked for being LGBTQI+. Whether you agree that this is a reasonable imposition on somebody's personal life, if the expectations are clearly explained in the hiring process, it at least demonstrates that codes of conduct are being applied fairly and consistently in a way that respects consent. While the Liberal Democrats certainly agree that LGBTQI people, or any other person for that matter, shouldn't be discriminated against in their day-to-day life or generally in their employment, what about other rights that can be balanced against that in the situation that we are debating here? And I'll refer to some international and state human rights instruments. There is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly on point 4 of Article 18, which states, and I quote, "The states parties to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions." End quote. Also, Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance." End quote. Also, our own Victorian Charter of Human Rights states in section 14B, "The freedom," and I quote, "the freedom to demonstrate his or her religion or belief in worship, observance, practice and teaching, either individually or as part of a community in public or in private." Also, section 19(1) on cultural rights. "All persons with a particular cultural, religious, racial or linguistic background must not be denied the right, in community with other persons of that background, to enjoy his or her culture, to declare and practice his or her religion and to use his or her language." End quote. So the question here is not just about protecting one set of rights against an attack or infringement on those rights, but how to balance these rights. There are aspects of this bill that I am supportive of, or at least very sympathetic to. Faith-based organisations should not be able to discriminate in the provision of taxpayer-funded services. But as Dr. Bark stated in his contribution, this doesn't really seem to happen very often. I am also sympathetic to students, as they are not in the same position as adults when signing an employment contract, which calls into question the issue of consent. The likely outcome of this bill in relation to employment in faith-based schools is simply more box-ticking and bureaucracy to protect against future litigation. While recognising the complex emotions and deeply held beliefs on either side of this debate, it once again goes just a bit too far, and the Liberal Democrats can't support it. Being a libertarian is sometimes described as like being the only sober person in the car and no one will let you drive. The government is driving us into the dark.